And I'm the head of a group called the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, as Ellen said, which is an Israeli political organization. We started in 1997 when the Oslo peace process was in a state of collapse. Rabin had been assassinated, Netanyahu had been elected the first time, and we in the Israeli peace movement wanted to re-engage in resisting the occupation. So we wanted to do that, but you know, occupation is a very abstract kind of a concept, even for Israelis, who are about as removed from it as you are here. And so we focused on the issue of house demolitions, you know, after talking to our Palestinian partners, because this is one of the most painful parts of the occupation. Israel has demolished, until today, about 55,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territories. But, you know, we have to remember that this is on the backdrop of probably 60,000 homes that were demolished in the Nakba in 1948 and in years after in a very systematic way, plus thousands more houses inside Israel until today of Palestinians, Bedouins are being demolished. There's one famous community you might know in the Negev that's called Al-Arakib, which has been demolished about 120 times already and rebuilt by the residents and with support from Israeli activists. So, you know, we've been doing that work for many years. And for many years, the end game was clear, and that was the two-state solution. We supported the two-state solution, even though it wasn't a just and fair solution, but we supported that because the Palestinians had accepted that. You know, Arafat and the PLO in 1988 accepted the two-state solution. So I'm not going to be more Catholic than the Pope. It was good enough for Arafat, it was good enough for me. And that was our program for many years, and the whole point of our resisting house demolitions and working on the issue of house demolitions was to expose how the occupation works, what Israel's intentions are, and of course the human suffering that's a part of the occupation. But, you know, when the two-state solution died, you know, everybody has a different cutoff point. There are some among us, like J Street people, who think it's still alive. I mean, people are clinging on to it. You know, I think for at least 10 years. Well, that's what I want to talk about tonight, partly, is that there was never a two-state option. I mean, it was never an actual political plan or an actual option, but it was clear that it was dead at least a decade ago. And the problem then is that you can't be in a political struggle without an end game. You know, in South Africa, where many of us of my generation were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, you know, everything we did over the years always had an end game. It was one person, one vote. That was the program, that was the plan, that was the bottom line. So we all knew what we were BDSing for in those days, what we were struggling for. Today, we have a very vibrant movement against the occupation, let's say. That's become a slogan, end the occupation. I'm going to argue tonight that I don't think there is an occupation. I think we should stop using that term. But that's, you know, and we have all kinds of slogans. We're doing BDS, and we're doing this campaign and that campaign, and we have organizations that do very good work, but all without an end game. What do we want? What's our plan? What's our vision? And you can't be a political player without an end game. So over the last year and a half, a number of us, I would say a core group of about 50 Palestinians, mainly from within Israel, Many connected to the Balad party, if you know Balad Tejamo, which is the Arab nationalist party in Israel that was founded by Azmi Bashara. But many academics and intellectuals and many young people are part of it, but also Palestinians from the territories and from abroad and from the camps, together with maybe 25 or 30 Israeli Jews. And we've spent the last year and a half trying to formulate a program of a one-state solution. In other words, a new political program that we can actually bring forward as a political program. And we have it's a 10-point program, but what's interesting is on the back, we have in the beginning, we're going to launch in April. We haven't launched this campaign. We call it the One Democratic State campaign. We're going to launch it in April. But one of the questions is, who are we? Who do you represent? We have to show people that we actually represent a meaningful voice. So we've begun by getting people to endorse our program, Palestinians and Israelis. So you'll see on this list so far, now we have several hundred names. But until this was published a couple weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, we had about 150 names. And you'll recognize some of them, Palestinians and Israelis, although many of them are more local people, more community people, younger people that you won't know. This is an important issue to deal with. I'm not going to get into that, but the book that I have, actually, I guess it's for sale in the back, War Against the People. I've been working on this issue of Palestine with others, of course, for many years. And the issue itself is important. It's an important issue to deal with because it destabilizes the entire Middle East. But it also has a global aspect to it. I'm not going to get into that tonight. That's what the War Against the People is about. But what I'm really trying to argue is that Israel is exporting the occupation. It's, the occupation, what we call the occupied territories, are essentially a laboratory in which Israel develops and perfects weapon systems, security systems, surveillance systems, tactics of population control, what I call technologies of repression. And in the end, what it's really exporting is the concept of a security state, where you can be a democracy, like Israel claims to be a democracy, but everything is subordinated to security. And this is a whole model, and JVP, that's one of the groups sponsoring tonight's talk, has a program called Deadly Exchange that is trying to document Israeli involvement in the American police forces, security forces. That's very important. But beyond that, Israel is really trying to sell a new concept in a way called the security state. So all I'm saying is that the Palestinian issue, I call this global Palestine. Because the Palestinian issue, in a sense, Israel over Palestine, is a microcosm of the global north over the global south. And by looking at how Israel, now we're not talking about, just an occupation or a short-term repression. We're talking about 50 years, or you could actually say 70 years, or you could say more than a century of an Israeli war against the Palestinian people. When Israel attacks Gaza in the disproportionate way it does, there's no relation between the amount of force Israel uses and the actual military threat. In fact, it's experimenting with new types of weaponry that in my book, I describe the new kinds of weapons used for the first time in Gaza and in the West Bank in many cases. But the Gazans aren't the point. The Palestinians aren't the point. The Palestinians, it's harsh to say this, but the Palestinians are the guinea pigs. They're the ones that are being experimented on. You have to look at the occupied territory as a resource for Israel, a country that has a laboratory that it can do anything it wants to, literally, to Palestinians without any threat of sanctions, that is then exporting the occupation. This is the point. Israel, is the fourth largest nuclear power in the world. It's the sixth largest arms exporter. So I would suggest to you that the Palestinian issue has implications for all of us way beyond Palestine itself. Okay, having said that, obviously we're concerned about resolving this issue, between Israelis and Palestinians. So let's come back to that. And what I want to suggest tonight is a whole different way of looking at this conflict. We call it a conflict. The Israel-Palestine conflict or the Israeli-Arab conflict. It's not a conflict. And the words you use and the approach you take determines the conclusions you come to and the political programs that you suggest. So it's very important to understand what's going on in the actual way. This is not a conflict. What I'm saying here is that the terms we use are wrong. A conflict is between two sides, right? And the sides are roughly symmetrical, and they disagree about something. And the way you resolve a conflict is the sides get together, they negotiate, you come to some kind of a compromise, and you resolved it. Well, that's not what's happening here. This is instead an instance of settler colonialism, just like the United States is, but it's settler colonialism. In other words, it has to do with settlers, the Zionist settlers of 125 years ago and so on, coming to this country with the intention of taking it over. They weren't immigrants with the intention of integrating into the society. They had the intention of taking it over, and they're very clear about that. I mean, they said that very clearly. They saw this as the land of Israel, and it's all the land of Israel. It wasn't 78% of the country they were aspiring to. There was no green line. There was no occupation, and most important, there was no other side. When the white settlers came to the United States or to North America and began their process of displacing and eliminating the Native Americans weren't another side. They weren't negotiating with them. They weren't, settler colonialism is unilateral. That's the thing to understand here. This is a unilateral process of taking over a country. And every settler colonial movement makes up a narrative. It makes up a story of why the settlers are entitled to that land rather than the indigenous. See, and the story usually has to do with God, somehow. Well, here it's easy. God gave us the land. I mean, trump that. And the whole story of, there was a revolt against Rome, and we lost, and the Jews were exiled, and now we're coming back. It's a story. It never happened. There was never an exile. There's not one reputable historian, even Israeli, that has ever written about an exile. Romans never exiled people. They sold slaves, that's true, but they never exiled peoples. And in fact, what's interesting is that almost immediately after the revolt, the country was devastated, it's true, but in the century afterwards, the country flourished. That was when you had the emergence of what's called the Jerusalem Talmud, and very famous Talmudic centers like Yavne and Sepphoris and so on, Sippori in Hebrew. So that this whole story was made up. And I can tell you the man that made it up, Ben Zion Dinur, who was one of the first Israeli minister of education. And they made up this story, and the point of the story is we're coming home, right, to a land that God gave us. It's our homeland exclusively. And this is the land of Israel. So that, in a sense, I'm not going to get into that whole history, but this issue of exclusivity is crucial. You know, because you have that element until today. In settler colonialism, there's no other side. In any case of settler colonialism, the indigenous are not your friends. You don't get along with them. Maybe in the first hour or two, you know, they save your life by teaching you how to grow something, and then you kill them. You know, there's no relationship between settlers and the indigenous people. And then you've got this whole issue of exclusivity, because every settler group claims an exclusive. If you recognize the indigenous as a side, or as a people with rights, or that have some kind of claim to the land, you're undercutting your own claims. Then you have to deal with them. The way you eliminate them and displace them is simply by denying them any claim, any sense of agency. So that Zionism was based on three elements that did that together. One was the Bible. When you look at the Old Testament, look at you know where ISIS came from? Read the book of Joshua sometime. It's a book of genocide. And you have genocide all through the Old Testament. So there's an exclusive, God gave us this land, period. And you have strangers. You're supposed to be nice to strangers, but they're always strangers. There's never any integration. And not only that, if they raise their heads, like in the Bible, the people of Nablus do, you kill them. I mean, there's zero tolerance. Didn't begin with Giuliani, believe me. So that's one element. The second element was ethnocracy. Israel presents itself as a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. You hear this every day. And it looks like a democracy. You know, if you go to Israel, most people are kind of white. You know, it has a European standard of living. Most people speak English. I mean, it looks Europeanish at least. But in fact, it's not a democracy. It's what we call an ethnocracy. An ethnocracy is when a country belongs to a particular people. And all you have to do is look at the Israeli flag, and you can see that. In other words, in this country claimed by Zionism, the whole country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, the flag represents one particular group with the Star of David, and that's a minority group. Because today, the Israeli Jews are a minority in this country. There already is a Palestinian majority, even before refugees return. Well, this comes out of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. You know, Germany before the end of World War II, and Russia, Poland, Hungary, until today are ethnocracies. Russia belongs to the Russians. Hungary belongs to the Hungarians. Look at the way they're treating refugees from Syria that try to come in. It's xenophobia. So Israel is basically a transposition of Eastern European tribal nationalism into the Middle East. So actually Israel is much more similar to Poland or Hungary or Russia than it is to the United States. And that's where the exclusivity comes from. Because the idea is this is our country and it belongs to us exclusively. And the third element, again, is settler colonialism that has that same element that we talked about. So you have three elements that feed into Zionism, all of which have an exclusive claim to the country, and all of which deny any claim, or the existence even, the collective existence of an indigenous people. So that then the whole process was taking over the country. And if there's one word that I would use to characterize the entire Zionist movement over the last 125 years, and it's a word we use in Israel, It's the word Judaization. It isn't a term we use very often. It doesn't have a legal reference like occupation or apartheid. But we're Judaizing the Galilee. That's an official Israeli government policy. We're Judaizing Jerusalem. And overall, the idea is our goal is to Judaize the country. In other words, the goal is to turn an Arab country into a Jewish country, to turn Palestine into the land of Israel. That's the overall goal. And what I would argue is that it's done. In other words, we talk about conquest in Zionism. Even though it belongs to us, we still conquer it. Joshua conquered as well. So it's a word that's acceptable. So we conquered the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, not with the intention of giving it back. This was the last stage of a century-long process of Judaization. And so, you see, the problem with the word occupation, I mean, I say it's not a conflict, but I also say there's no occupation. I think we shouldn't use that word. Because now, it's true, it is an occupation in international law. It's certainly an occupation if you're a Palestinian. But the word occupation implies an external territory. It's outside of Israel. You have Israel proper, and then you have the occupied territory, that bifurcation. And in all the negotiations, of course, Israel's fine. We're not negotiating anything about the 78%. That's outside of negotiations. We're talking about the 22% that is so-called occupied, with the idea that somehow that's outside, that can be detached, that Israel would actually be willing to turn that into a Palestinian state. But it's not true. That was never, ever, ever the intention of Israel. In fact, Israel has never recognized the existence of a Palestinian people, let alone its collective rights. In the brightest days of Oslo, 1993, Rabin demanded of Arafat that he write a letter. And actually, he wrote a very moving letter. You should look it up. Not only recognizing the state of Israel, but recognizing it as a legitimate construct. Nothing grudging. He had to genuinely, wholeheartedly accept the idea of Israel as a Jewish state, which he did, much to Edward Said's consternation, but he did. In return, Israel did not recognize the Palestinian people and their rights. All Israel did in Oslo was to recognize the PLO as a negotiating partner. That's it. With an open-ended negotiations. It had no goal. Arafat would sometimes say we're negotiating a two-state solution. Rabin would correct him and say, no, we're not. Maybe, who knows? Maybe that'll emerge. We have no idea where the negotiations are going. And that's, of course, why they failed. Because, when Oslo began, there were 200,000 Israeli settlers in what's called the occupied territory. By the time it ended 7 years later, in the year 2000, there were 400,000 settlers. Today, there's almost 800,000 Israelis living in the Palestinian, what we would consider an occupied Palestinian territory. So what I'm saying is there was never any pause in the process of Judaizing the entire country. There was never a pause even. No one ever really thought about it. And what I would argue is it's done. In other words, it's finished. The process of Judaization. And I would argue that the West Bank is Judea and Samaria today. It's an integral part of Israel. There is no more Israel proper and an occupied territory to detach. And that's a problem with BDS. BDS still reflects the two-state idea. It hasn't been updated, and that's a real problem. We've always supported BDS, the boycotts, divestment, sanctions movement. But one of the elements is end the occupation. that I would argue is a diversion, because it is ended, and there never was an occupation. And the other element is equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel. So here you've got that Israel occupation dichotomy that we have to do away with, I think. So BDS has to be rethought and reformulated in light of a new analysis and in light of, I think, the one-state program that I want to present. So, in case you still didn't get the point, Israel imposed over the occupied territory what I call a matrix of control. In other words, in case you still didn't get it, that it's not Palestinian, it's ours, we're going to keep it, we simply created what we call facts on the ground that are so massive and so permanent that it makes Israeli control irreversible.